They said my mother passed quietly, her breath fading like a candle at dusk. But 3 days after the funeral, I found a letter frozen beneath the snowbank by her back steps, and it was written to me. To me. I returned to my childhood house in late winter, when the fields were colorless and the air held every sound too long. The neighbors spoke in gentle tones, repeating the same sentence about peace and rest, as if it were something they needed me to believe. Inside the house, everything remained exactly as my mother had left it. Her coat on the peg, her teacup by the sink, the clock still ticking. Grief had not arrived all at once. It waited, watching, and then the letter changed the shape of everything. The snow had been falling all night, the kind that doesn't announce itself. No wind, no sound. Just a slow covering. I stepped out the back door just after sunrise, not for any reason I could name. Habit, maybe. Or the way grief keeps your body moving even when your mind is still somewhere else. The porch boards were slick, the air sharp enough to sting my nose. Everything looked muted, as if the world had pulled a blanket over itself. That's when I saw it, just a corner, off-white, barely there. At first I thought it was trash, or a receipt, maybe? Or part of a grocery bag that had drifted over from the road. Things had a way of ending up here, carried by weather or carelessness. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to ignore it. The house behind me creaked softly, settling, like it was breathing on its own. The snowbank sat beside the back steps, uneven from boots and shovels. I stepped closer. The paper didn't move. It was stiff, caught in ice. I bent down. The cold went straight through my jeans, straight into my knees. I brushed away the snow with my glove, slow, careful, like the paper might disappear if I startled it. More of it appeared, an envelope, old-fashioned, thick, not trash. I pinched the corner and pulled. It resisted at first, held fast by frozen ground. When it finally came loose, it made a soft tearing sound, like fabric giving way. Ice cracked along the fold. My glove stuck to it for a second before I pulled my hand free. I didn't look at the name right away. I already knew. My mother's handwriting had a way of leaning forward, as if the words were trying to go somewhere before she was ready. Careful, slanted. Every letter finished cleanly, no wasted strokes. I'd seen it my whole life, on lunch notes, recipe cards, birthday envelopes taped to the refrigerator. And there it was again, on the front, my name, no stamp, no postmark, just my name, written with intention. I stood there longer than I meant to, the cold creeping into my fingers, my feet. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, weighed down by more than paper. My hands started to shake, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. Why would she leave this here? The neighbors had said she died peacefully. The nurse said she slept most of the night. Everyone had spoken softly, kindly, like there was nothing more to say. I tucked the envelope against my coat and went back inside. The kitchen was dim, the morning light still unsure of itself. Frost clung to the window above the sink. Her teacup was where she'd left it, clean, upside down on the towel. The clock over the stove ticked steadily, loud in the quiet. I didn't open the letter yet. I set it on the table and stared at it like it might move on its own. My gloves lay beside it, damp and half-melted, leaving dark spots on the wood. The smell of cold followed me in, sharp and metallic. I made coffee I didn't want, poured it into a mug I didn't choose, let it sit untouched. Eggs. My fingers were numb now, but not from the snow. They tingled as the warmth came back, a dull ache that made me clench and unclench my hands. I kept glancing at the envelope, counting the seconds between looks, as if spacing them out might soften whatever waited inside. I tried to think logically. Maybe she dropped it, maybe she meant to mail it and forgot. But the back steps weren't on the way to the mailbox. And my mother wasn't careless with things that mattered. She folded towels with edges aligned. She saved rubber bands in a jar. She never left words unfinished. I picked up the envelope. It was cold, still colder than the room. The paper had gone soft where the snow had melted, the fibers raised. I turned it over, checking the flap. It was sealed, not glued shut carelessly, but pressed firm, deliberate. My thumb hovered there. I thought of her hands, the way they shook at the end. Wet camber, step pap, camper, purse and passing. The way she'd squeezed mine once, hard, like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the shape of it. I slid my finger under the flap. The paper resisted, then gave. A quiet sound, final. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. No extras, no explanations tucked in, just the letter. I didn't read it right away. I pressed it flat on the table, smoothing the creases like she used to do with bills. The clock kept ticking. Humber, refrigerator, and Nopper de Pure. The clock kept ticking. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on wet pavement, life continuing, unaware. And when I finally unfolded it, the ink looked lighter than I remembered, not faded completely. Just softened, like it had been written with care but also caution. The first line began with my name. Knack. My breath caught there, sharp and sudden. I hadn't expected that. It made it feel immediate. Personal. As if she were standing just behind me, waiting to see if I'd keep reading. I did. Her words were steady, not projetic, not for Ningras Top Tower. Her words were steady, apologetic, not for dying, not for leaving, but for something else. Something she said she'd waited too long to say. I stopped, folded the paper back up. My hands were shaking again, worse this time. I pressed them flat on the table, grounding myself in the grain of the wood, the small scratch near the edge where she dropped a pan years ago. The house felt different now, smaller, like it was holding its breath. I thought about where I'd found the letter. Not in a drawer, not in a box under the bed, but outside, in the snow, hidden, but not buried. I realized then that she hadn't wanted this discovered by accident. She'd placed it where only someone looking for her would find it, someone who knew the back steps, who remembered how she walked there every morning, careful of the ice. I looked toward the door. The snowbank was already shrinking in the rising sun, edges softening, revealing patches of dark ground beneath. Whatever had been hidden there wouldn't stay hidden long. I folded the letter again, slower this time. Slipped it back into the envelope. For now, outside, a bird called once, sharp and clear. The sound echoed, then disappeared. I stood there alone in the kitchen, holding something my mother had trusted to Winter. And for the first time since they told me she'd died in peace, I wondered what it had cost her to keep the rest quiet. The nurse's voice comes back to me in pieces, not the words, the tone, soft, measured, like she was afraid of waking someone, even though my mother was already gone. She stood near the window, hands folded, eyes kind but distant. Morning light touched her shoulder and stopped there, as if it didn't want to go any further. She slept most of the night, the nurse said. Her voice didn't rise or fall, it stayed even. Yay, I remember nodding, because that seemed like the right thing to do. I remember thanking her, because gratitude comes easily when you don't know what else to offer. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. My mother's lotion, still clinging to the air, like she might return to use it. The nurse said there was no struggle, no fear, no pain she could see. She said it the way people say weather reports, clear, final, as if the night had passed according to plan. Later, family friends repeated it to me in the hallway, in the parking lot, over the phone. Each Shamasafa Kabalashas a Kamadavar Sadwar. Each time, the same words came back, just arranged slightly differently. Peaceful, quiet. She didn't suffer. You should be grateful, they nodded as they spoke, their heads moving in small synchronized motions. It struck me then, not sharply, but slowly, how similar they all sounded, as if they'd practiced together. As if there were a version everyone agreed to keep, I held on to it because it was easier than questioning it. At the funeral, the ground was still hard with frost. The air cut through coats and gloves, biting at exposed skin. Someone handed me a tissue I didn't need. Someone else touched my shoulder briefly, like a tap to remind me I was still there. The service was short. No one lingered by the grave. People stepped forward, placed flowers, stepped back again. Their breath rose in small white clouds and disappeared. Conversation stayed low, careful, as if volume itself might be disrespectful. I noticed how quickly they moved on. By the time the last clump of dirt hit the coffin, people were already turning away, already thinking of warm cars and coffee waiting somewhere else. The minister said a final amen, and it hung in the air for half a second before dissolving. I stayed until the workers began to shift their weight, unsure of what to do with someone who didn't know when to leave. Ask any huncher. That night, alone in the house, the words followed me from room to room. She slept. She didn't suffer. It was peaceful. They settled into the corners like dust. And now, standing in the kitchen days later, the letter heavy in my coat pocket, those words feel thinner, fragile, like Konder Taudimater one and Ernix, like something pressed too flat too quickly. I sit at the table and place the envelope in front of me again just to see it there. The clock ticks louder now, each second landing with intention. I think about the nurse's eyes, how they didn't meet mine for very long, how she spoke kindly but never personally. I wonder if she was telling me the truth, or if she was telling me what she'd been trained to say. I think about my mother's face the last time I saw her awake. The way her mouth opened slightly, then closed, the effort it took. The pause afterward, long enough to feel unfinished. She didn't look afraid, but she didn't look settled either. Family friends had stood in the doorway that night, whispering among themselves. Someone said, "She's resting," like it was a conclusion, not an observation. Someone else squeezed my arm and told me to go home, that there was nothing more to do. Nothing more to do. I realize now how quickly that phrase moved everything along, how it closed doors without asking what might still be inside. Cat. I take the letter out and turn it over in my hands. The paper makes a soft sound, dry now, but still marked by where the snow had touched it. I imagine my mother standing at the back steps in the cold breath visible, coat pulled tight. I imagine her looking toward the road, then down at the snowbank, placing it there. Ikite. Not giving it to me directly, not trusting it to the mail. I wonder how many people knew she'd written it. I wonder if anyone guessed what she meant to say and chose not to hear it. Silence can be generous that way. It lets everyone keep their hands clean. The house creaks above me, a familiar sound. The floorboard near the sink complains when I shift my weight. It always did. She used to joke that the house talked back. Now I'm not so sure it's joking. Yeah. För bestämma the bride effort the fanat of no one to cried epi, half a tadaxa defer. I think of the funeral again, how no one cried loudly, how grief stayed contained proper. There was comfort in that, I suppose, but there was also something missing, a hesitation, as if everyone knew not to stay too long in one place, as if lingering might uncover something. I realize then that peace can be useful. It smooths things over. It lets people move on without asking questions that don't have easy answers. Peace closes books before the last chapter is read. I look at the letter, at my name, my mother's careful hand, and I feel something shift, not anger, not yet. Just a quiet unease, like standing on ground that might not be as solid as it looks. The version they gave me no longer fits as neatly as it once did. Outside, the snow continues to melt, dripping steadily from the eaves. Each drop hits the ground and disappears. I watch it through the window, counting without meaning to. They wanted the story to end cleanly. They wanted it sealed and buried. But my mother left something out in the open, trusting time and weather to do their part. Sitting there holding her letter, I understand now that whatever she wrote wasn't meant to keep the peace. It was meant to disturb it. I fold the envelope carefully and slide it back into my pocket. Not to hide it, just to keep it close. The house feels quieter than before, as if it's waiting. And for the first time, I ask myself the question no one else did. What part of her story were they so eager to leave buried? The door sticks the way it always did. Just for a second, like it's deciding whether to let me in. I rest my hand on the knob and wait. The house is quiet behind me, not asleep, just aware. I turn it slowly, careful not to make a sound that feels too sudden. The hinges breathe out a low creak, familiar enough to feel like recognition. The room hasn't changed. Lavender comes first. Soft, faded, the scent she favored because it reminded her of her own mother. Beneath it, the dry smell of old paper, books, envelopes, folded notes kept longer than necessary. The air feels held, like it's been waiting for someone who took too long to return. The curtains are half opened, exactly how she left them. Morning light spills in, thin and pale, settling on the floor without warmth. Dust floats where the sun catches it, moving slowly, aimless. I stand in the doorway longer than I mean to. This room had always felt private, even when she was alive. Not secretive, just complete. Odd. Like everything in it already knew where it belonged. I had learned not to linger here unless invited. Now there's no one to ask. I take one step inside. The floor creaks softly beneath my weight, the same board near the foot of the bed. It creaks like it remembers me. Like it's surprised, her nightstand sits to the left, neat as ever. A folded blanket, the thin one she used when her legs felt cold. An empty glass, rim faintly clouded where her lips had touched it last. No pills, no clutter, nothing out of place, no letter. I look anyway, open the drawer, close it, check beneath the book she kept face down, as if pausing mid-thought. Nothing. The bed is made, not hastily. I am beside Jot anan and Amaz on Dadaramir. Not tucked too tight. Just prepared. The quilt is smoothed flat, corners aligned, pillows plumped and centered. It looks like someone had been getting the room ready for a guest, or maybe for her return. I sit down at the edge, the mattress dipping slightly beneath me. It feels strange, occupying a space she'd filled so completely. The quilt beneath my fingers is cool, textured, stitched with small, uneven flowers she once told me were meant to be imperfect. Perfect things don't last, she'd said. She was folding laundry when she said it. I hadn't asked what she meant. The envelope presses against my side, heavy in my coat pocket. I hadn't planned to bring it in here. It followed me without asking. I take my coat off slowly, lay it over the chair by the window. The envelope stays where it is. Between us, I look around the room, noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The slight dent in the carpet where her feet rested when she sat on the bed. The framed photo turned just slightly inward, angled away from the light. A pressed flower tucked into the corner of the mirror. I don't touch anything. I imagine her here in the evenings. The way she'd sit on the edge of the bed and remove her shoes one at a time. The quiet ritual of it. The pause before standing again. The breath she'd take, steadying herself. This room had held her tiredness, her thinking, her silences. If the letter wasn't here, it meant she hadn't wanted it to be. I pull the envelope out at last and rest it on my knee. My name looks out of place in this room, like it doesn't quite belong to the stillness. I wonder how many times she'd picked it up before deciding where to leave it. How many times she'd stood right here, looking around, considering. I picture her opening the nightstand drawer, shaking her head, looking under the bed, pausing at the dresser, her hand resting there longer than necessary, choosing not to leave it. Thought settles in my canyon. The thought settles in my chest, heavy but calm. She didn't want this room to carry the weight of what she'd written. She didn't want it found too easily, or too late. I lie back gently, shoes still on, staring at the ceiling. There's a faint water stain near the corner, shaped like a map of someplace unfamiliar. I remember her pointing it out once, laughing softly. "Looks like it's trying to leave," she said. I listen. The house makes its usual sounds. Pipes shifting, wood contracting, the low hum of distance. Somewhere a clock ticks, steady and patient. Time hasn't changed its habits just because she's gone. I hold the envelope against my chest now, feeling the slight bend of the paper inside. The letter feels alive in a way the room does not. It holds movement, intention. This room holds rest. I realized then that she protected the space, kept it clean of unfinished truths. Whatever she wrote wasn't meant to stay with her body. It wasn't meant to linger where she slept. She carried it elsewhere. I sit up slowly, smoothing the quilt where I've disturbed it. Old habits surface without permission. I stand, hesitate, then straighten the pillow again just in case. Before leaving, I look once more at the nightstand. At the empty glass. At the folded glass. At the folded blanket. I place my hand on the wood, feeling the faint grooves worn smooth by years of touch. "Okay," I whisper. The word feels small, enough. As I step back into the hallway, I pull the door nearly closed, not all the way. Just enough to leave a thin line of light slipping through the crack. The room doesn't feel abandoned. It feels complete. Behind me, the floor creaks again, settling. Ahead, the house stretches quiet and watchful. Kenna, I tuck the letter. I tuck the letter deeper into my pocket and move forward, understanding now that what my mother didn't leave behind here is exactly what she needed me to carry next. And the letter waits on the table between us, flat, still like it knows it has time. The house is quiet in the way it gets after noon, when the light shifts and everything seems to slow down with it. Sunlight falls through the kitchen window at an angle, touching the edge of the table, but not quite reaching the envelope. Dust floats there, unbothered. I sit down across from it. For a moment, I don't touch it. I let my hands rest in my lap, fingers curled loosely, as if I'm waiting for instructions. The clock keeps ticking, the refrigerator hums, somewhere in the walls something clicks and stops. I slide the envelope closer. The paper feels thinner now that it's dry, fragile, in a way that makes me careful. I slick my finger beneath the fold again, slower this time, afraid I'll tear something that can't be fixed. The flap opens with a soft sound, barely there. Inside, the letter is folded once. I lift it out and pause. This part feels ceremonial, though I don't know why. Like there's a right and wrong way to do it, and I'm not sure which I'm choosing. I unfold the page gently, smoothing it against the table with the flat of my hand. Her handwriting, her handwriting, her page. Not rushed, not tentative, just hers. I can't. The ink is faded, slightly lighter than I remember, but steady, no trembling lines, no corrections. The letters lean forward, patient and deliberate, the same way they always did on birthday cards taped to the fridge. The same way she wrote grocery lists and notes for the mailman. Seeing it like this makes my chest tighten in a way I wasn't prepared for. It feels closer than her voice. The letter begins with my name again. Below it, the first sentence. First. I'm sorry I waited, not sorry for leaving, not sorry for dying, sorry for waiting. I read it twice, just to be sure I'm not misunderstanding. My thumb traces the edge of the paper, following the faint impression of the pen where she pressed a little harder on certain words. She writes that silence can become a habit, that once you start choosing it, it gets easier to keep choosing it again. She says she told herself she was protecting people, that time would soften things. She says time didn't. I lean back in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me. My eyes lift from the page to the window, to the pale sky outside. A cloud passes slowly, unhurried. Yeah? I keep reading. She writes about a night. She doesn't date it, doesn't name the season. Just that night. The words are careful here, measured. She describes the cold, the power going out, a knock at the door she hadn't expected. She writes about standing in the hallway, listening to the sound of her own breathing before she opened it. She doesn't say who it was, crass, a crashance, only that she was told later, very clearly, never to speak of it again. My stomach tightens, slow and deep, like something turning over. I stop reading, pressing my palm flat against the paper, grounding it there. The kitchen feels smaller now, the walls closer. I think of how many nights she must have replayed that one. How many times she stood in this same room, touching the same table, holding these words inside instead of on paper. And when I look back down, my eyes catch on the spaces between sentences. They're wider here, intentional. Like she needed room to breathe while writing, she writes about fear without naming it. And about learning which truths are welcomed and which ones make people uncomfortable. She says she learned quickly which category hers belonged to. She says she was young enough then to believe obedience could be mistaken for safety. My throat tightens. I swallow. I can almost see her writing this late at night, the house quiet. Her hand moving steadily, stopping now and then, hovering over the page, considering, choosing each word the way someone chooses steps on thin ice. The letter doesn't accuse, it doesn't rage. It remembers. She writes that the cost of silence doesn't arrive all at once, it accumulates slowly, in small concessions. In decisions that feel harmless at the time. She says she paid it in pieces, in sleep lost, in trust withheld, in a part of herself she never quite got back. And I stop again. My fingers curl around the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. I think of all the things she never said. All the conversations that stayed polite, surface level. All the times I sensed something and didn't ask. She didn't give me details. She didn't need to. The weight of the restraint is enough. Near the bottom of the page, her handwriting changes just slightly. Not shakier. Just slower. The letters grow a fraction larger, like she wanted to be sure I could read them. Yeah, she writes that she didn't tell me sooner because she was afraid of changing the way I saw the world. Afraid that once something is named, it can't be returned to its quiet place. She says she knows now that quiet isn't the same as peace. My eyes blur. I blink hard, once, twice, until the words steady again. I don't let myself cry. Not yet. This doesn't feel like the moment for it. The letter ends without a signature. No love, no name. Just a final sentence, pressed a little deeper into the paper than the rest. Our ping for fa kak. I trust you to decide what comes next. I let the page fall back to the table. The silence that follows is thick, almost audible. The clock keeps ticking, faithful as ever. Face of error. Ever. Outside, a car passes, then another. Ordinary sounds, continuing as if nothing has shifted, but something has. I sit there for a long time, staring at the letter without reading it again. My mother's restraint feels heavier now than any confession could have been. She carried this quietly, carefully, long enough that it shaped her, and she gave it to me not as a demand, but as a choice. I fold the paper back along its original crease, aligning the edges the way she would have. The envelope waits nearby, open and patient. When I slide the letter back inside, it feels like returning something living to rest. I don't seal it. I place it beside my plate, where she used to set notes reminding me to eat. The light has shifted again. The sun has moved on, leaving the kitchen dimmer, softer. I sit there until the clock tells me an hour has passed. Some truths announce themselves loudly. Others arrive the way this one did. Carefully written, quietly delivered, asking only to be read. I stand at last, carrying the envelope with me as I move toward the hallway. The house doesn't resist. It creaks, settles, accepts. As I turn off the kitchen light, I realize the question isn't what happened that night. It's how long the silence was allowed to last. The wind starts before the snow does. A low sound along the roofline, like the house clearing its throat. I'm standing at the window when it comes back to me, not the memory itself, but the shape of it. The way winter presses closer when the light fades early. The way the world narrows to what's inside your walls. The letter is open on the table behind me. I don't turn around yet. Outside, bare branches sway and scrape against one another, slow and restless. The sky has gone the color of old tin. I imagine how it must have looked that night, years ago, when the storm began without asking permission. I take a breath and go back to the table. Inek. The paper feels warmer now, like it's absorbed something from my hands. I read the next lines carefully, slower than before, as if pace might soften the meaning. She writes, it was winter, the kind that makes you believe staying inside is enough. I pause there. I remember storms like that, power lines sagging under ice, radios going quiet. The way the dark arrived early and stayed. My mother had always lit candles before the lights went out, not after. Preparation disguised as habit. She writes that the power failed just after dusk. The house went silent in a way she noticed immediately. No hum from the refrigerator, no clock in the kitchen, only the wind pushing itself against the siding, testing. Fakdo fa pasas. She was sitting alone, she says, a blanket over her knees, tea gone cold, waiting for nothing in particular. Then the knock. I feel it in my chest before I read the next sentence. Yeah, she writes that she didn't hesitate. That's what surprises her most, looking back. The knock came from someone she knew, someone who belonged to her life enough that fear didn't arrive first. I glance at the door. It's closed, locked, the chain hanging loose where she used to keep it during storms. I imagine her standing in the hallway, candle in hand, light trembling against the walls. She writes about opening the door and letting the cold rush in. About how the wind carried snow inside with the person who stepped over the threshold. About recognizing their voice before she saw their face. Relief, she admits. Relief that it was someone familiar. That relief didn't last. She doesn't describe the argument directly. She writes around it, like someone avoiding thin ice. Raised voices. Words said too quickly. Words that didn't fit the room once spoken. I notice how her sentences tighten here. Shorter. Less forgiving. She writes that something was taken, not borrowed, not misplaced. Seeken. Something that could not be returned. I sit back in my chair, the legs scraping softly against the floor. The house does feel smaller now, just as she said. The walls closer, the ceiling lower. As if the story itself is changing the space, she writes about fear arriving late. About how it came not with the first shout, but afterward, in the quiet that followed, in the sound of the door closing again, in the way the candle shook in her hand long after the flames steadied. She writes that she stood there for a long time, listening to the wind, listening to her own breathing, waiting for something to make sense. My fingers curl into the edge of the paper. I realize she's not telling me everything. She's telling me only what the house remembers. The cold, the dark, silence afterward. She leaves the rest unnamed, perhaps because naming it would give it a shape too sharp to hold. She writes that the next day the power came back, lights blinked on, clocks reset themselves. Neighbors asked if she'd been cold, if she needed anything. Life resumed its practiced rhythm. She did not speak of the night. She writes that she was told directly not to. I stop there. The word told sits heavier than anything else on the page. It implies authority, certainty, someone who expected obedience and believed they would get it. My mind begins to reach for names, faces, voices. People who moved easily through her life back then. People who knocked without calling first. People who smiled and were believed. I don't like where my thoughts go. She writes that silence felt safer than disbelief. She understood, even then, how quickly stories can be reshaped once they leave your mouth. How easily concern can turn into doubt. She writes that she chose quiet, not because it was right. Because it was survivable. The house creaks above me, a single sharp sound. I'd flinch, then let myself breathe again. I hadn't noticed how still I'd been sitting. I think of all the winters since then. All the storms she lived through without mentioning this one. All the nights she lit candles and waited for morning without explaining why. Who else knew? The question comes uninvited and doesn't leave. She doesn't say if she told anyone, not on a friend, not a relative. Not the people who checked on her the next day. The letter goes quiet there, as if the page itself refuses to speculate. I read the paragraph again, searching for clues in the margins. A word pressed harder, a pause, anything, nothing. The restraint is its own answer. Yeah. I'd fold the page slightly, then smooth it back out, careful not to crease it wrong. The kitchen light flickers once, not enough to go out, just enough to remind me how fragile illumination can be. Outside, the wind has picked up. Snow begins to fall, light at first, then steadier. The timing feels deliberate, though I know it isn't. I imagine her that night, after the door closed, sitting back down, wrapping the blanket tighter, listening to the house settle around her secret. I imagine how many people stood in this same kitchen over the years, drinking coffee, talking about weather, about nothing at all. How many times that night almost surfaced and didn't. She writes one final line about it. Some nights leave marks you learn to live around. I lower the letter. The room feels changed now, not darker, just altered, like furniture shifted slightly in the night and never moved back. I realize this house has been holding that night inside its walls longer than I've been alive. I wonder who else sensed it, who else heard something in her voice and chose not to ask. The snow outside thickens, blurring the edges of the world. The door remains closed, the lock secure. I fold the letter and hold it against my chest, feeling the steady beat beneath it. Whatever was taken that night shaped her, shaped the way she moved through rooms, the way she trusted, the way she stayed quiet. And now, standing here, I understand something else. This story didn't belong to her alone. Someone else carried it too, and they've been living their life as if winter never came. The snow crunches under my shoes as I walk up the narrow path to his house. The wind presses against my coat, cold enough to make my cheeks sting. The sky hangs low and gray, heavy with clouds that promise more snow. And now, I carry a loaf of bread in my hands, warm, simple, or ordinary. An excuse, a way to appear casual. I pause at the gate. The paint is chipped, frost crawling along the edges. I notice the same crooked fence post I remembered from years ago, leaning slightly toward his yard. It looks tired, like it's been standing sentinel through too many winters. I knock. Once, twice, the door opens slowly. He stands there, older now, his hair thin and white at the temples. He doesn't smile. Doesn't invite me in with words. I step inside. The kitchen smells faintly of wood smoke and something sweet baking, maybe from a forgotten cookie tin. He gestures for me to sit at the small table by the window. I place the bread down carefully, as if setting it there might make this meeting less heavy. He doesn't speak first. He just watches the floor. I notice the way the light from the window catches the dust motes, swirling lazily in the quiet. The quiet itself feels like a presence. I clear my throat. I found a letter, I say. My voice sounds too loud in the silence. From my mother. His eyes flick up briefly, then return to the floor. No acknowledgement, no question. Just the weight of him sitting there, steady and immovable. I hesitate. It mentions a night. Something she never spoke about. He nods once, barely. Did you know? I ask softly. He doesn't answer. Not with words, just the slow exhale of someone holding too much inside. After a moment, he finally speaks. His voice is low, measured. She asked me once, he says. She wanted to know. If a truth could still matter after time had buried it, I lean forward. The bread, warm under my palm, now feels heavy and, "What did you say?" He shakes his head small. I never answered her. The words hang. I never answered her. The words hang. It was hang. Between us, thick, unfinished. I noticed the shadows in the corners of the room. Dust on the shelves, a cracked mug on the counter. Each object seems to carry a memory, though silent. I think of that winter night, the storm, the knock, the voices raised in my mother's house. What had he seen? What did he carry with him all these years? I search his eyes. They are steady but distant, not absent, watching but not moving. There's a careful restraint there, the kind that comes from seeing too much too young and knowing you can't change it. I stand. The chair groans softly beneath me. He doesn't rise, doesn't offer to walk me out. I feel the weight of that silence pressing against my back as I move toward the door. The hallway smells faintly of pine and something I can't name. I reach the threshold. My hand rests briefly on the doorknob, and I feel the warmth of the house behind me, the quiet life continuing in— Thank you, I whisper. He doesn't reply. He doesn't need to. Outside, the snow has started again, heavier now, covering footprints with each flake. The world looks unchanged, serene even. But I can feel the layers beneath, the hidden shapes, the nights that stayed unspoken, the truths kept in silence, their weight heavy in the air. I pause at the gate, turning to look back at his house. The window glows softly, warm inside. Yet the stillness there feels guarded, closed off. Like the story never left the walls, I pull my coat tighter. The loaf of bread feels lighter now, almost inconsequential. An ordinary thing for an extraordinary weight. I begin to walk home. The crunch of snow under my feet is loud in the quiet street. I keep thinking of the night my mother feared, of voices I never heard, of someone I trusted who saw too much. He didn't walk me to the door. He didn't need to. And yet the question lingers. What had he seen that night? The wind rises, pushing snow into my face. I taste it, cold and sharp. My breath clouds before me. Each step forward feels like moving through a story that's only partially told, each footprint marking a trail I don't fully understand. I reach the bend in the road, the familiar glow of my house waiting. The door seems smaller now, the walls slightly closer. I know I will sit at the table, open the letter again, and reread her words, feeling the echoes of what he didn't say, what he chose to keep. And somewhere in the quiet, I understand that this silence, hers, has been waiting for me to notice it. For now, the snow falls, heavy, unrelenting, unanswered. I move inside, carrying the weight of questions that aren't ready to be answered yet. The fluorescent lights flicker above me, a sharp, uneven buzz that makes the air feel thinner. Rows of metal cabinets stretch into the distance, gray and cold, each drawer labeled with the patience of decades. I stand at the end of an aisle, fingers brushing the edge of a file drawer as if the metal might whisper its secrets. The smell of old paper hits first, dust, ink, and a faint tang of mildew. It's the kind of smell that holds memory hostage. I pull open a drawer, one of hundreds. Files stacked vertically like sentries. Waiting, I hesitate, hand hovering. Each folder has a label, a date, a name I don't recognize yet. The clerk glances at me from the counter. He's young, or at least looks it, wearing a sweater that's too warm for this room. He doesn't smile. Just waits, knowing the rules. I'm looking for a report, I say softly, not wanting the words to echo too loudly. From years ago. Around December, he nods once, taps a drawer with a key, and motions me over. The drawer resists at first, then slides open with a soft metallic groan. Inside, the files are thinner than I expected. Most are complete. Some are barely a single sheet folded over itself. I pull one out at random and scan the top. The heading reads Resolved. Bold, simple, the report is thin. Sparse, cold, no names that match my mother. No mention of the storm she wrote about. Only a date. Only the barest details. I feel my chest tighten. The dates line up with the night she described. The storm, the knock, the raised voices, the fear she never named, but she's absent from the words. Only the event remains, like a shadow of a life rewritten. The clerk watches quietly. He doesn't ask questions. I'm glad. Some truths aren't ready for explanations. I flip through the pages slowly. The ink is fading. Typing errors corrected with thick black marks. Certain sentences circled, others crossed out entirely. Someone decided what mattered. Someone decided what could be buried. I trace a line with my finger, careful not to smudge the paper. My hand hovers over the words, as if touching them might bring her back for a moment. The gaps are heavy. Every missing detail feels deliberate, calculated. I sit at the nearest table, file open before me. The fluorescent hum presses against the quiet corners of the room. I copy the report by hand. Slow, meticulous. Every letter, every dash. I do it as if committing a ritual. Ink scratches softly against paper. My hand grows stiff, fingers smudged, but I don't stop. I can't. Not until I've captured every word, every blank space. I glance at the clerk. His eyes avoid mine. Maybe he's seen this before. Maybe he knows how fragile the past can be, how easily it can vanish under someone else's pen. The more I write, the more I feel her presence in the room, not as a ghost, not as a shadow, just the memory of her careful, deliberate attention. The same patience she used in letters, in meals, in small gestures that mattered more than they seemed. I pause, hand hovering above the paper. I try to imagine the person who chose which details would survive. Someone with authority. Someone who believed that a story could be neat, resolved, and finished. Someone who believed her life could be reduced to a file, a few sentences, a date. And yet here I am, rewriting it by hand, refusing their conclusion. I notice the gaps again. The empty lines between sentences, the spaces where her name should have been, the silences. Wah! I feel the weight of them pressing against the quiet in the room. The fluorescent light flickers again, and for a moment the shadows in the corners seem sharper, closer. I copy the final line carefully. It ends with the words, "No further action necessary." I fold the page, smooth it, and place it in my notebook. It feels heavier than it should. Not the weight of paper, but the weight of choices made long ago, the choices that shaped the story I thought I knew. I stand, stretching cramped fingers. The clerk doesn't move. He doesn't offer guidance, doesn't comment. He doesn't need to. The quiet is enough. I carry the notebook to the counter. He watches as I slide it toward me. No one else here notices. No one else understands. Maybe no one else ever would. Outside, the wind presses against the building, rattling a loose pane. Snow has begun again, covering footprints, covering tracks. The world moves as if nothing has changed. I step into it anyway, notebook clutched to my chest. The pages hold my own handwriting, my own deliberate choices. Each word I copied feels like reclaiming a small piece of her story, a story someone else tried to bury. I pause at the edge of the lot, looking back at the gray building, the flickering lights inside. Who had the power to rewrite her story? Who decided which truths would survive and which would be erased? I don't know. But I do know this: I will carry the story forward, even with its missing parts, even with its blanks, even with the silence. The snow falls heavier now, softly, relentlessly. Each flake covers the world, but not the truth I've copied by hand, not the memory I hold. I start walking home. Footsteps crunch against the frozen path. Each one feels louder than it should. A rhythm that carries me back, carrying the weight of questions, of gaps, of shadows that follow a life long after the doors are closed and the lights have gone out. And somewhere beneath the snow and the quiet, I feel her presence, watching, waiting, trusting me to decide what matters, what survives, and what the world will finally know. The notebook is warm in my hands. The story is alive again, fragile but breathing, and I know I will return. Because someone chose to erase the truth once, and someone must remember it now. The wind cuts through the cemetery that day, sharp and cold, and snow swirls along the paths, catching on coats and boots. I remember standing at the edge, the grave open before us, the ground raw and wet. He was there, apart from the rest. His coat was too fine, dark wool pressed neatly, edges sharp against the white. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He just watched, quiet, observant. At the time, I told myself he was a distant acquaintance. Someone my mother had once met at a meeting, a neighbor of a neighbor, or a man who had passed through this small town without leaving a mark. But now, years later, his face returns, not blurred, not softened by memory, sharp, almost too clear. His eyes dark, calculating. The corners of his mouth a line that never smiles. I see him again in my mind, standing behind the crowd, hat in hand, gloved fingers brushing the brim. The snow falling on him, but he barely moves. The silence around him is almost a presence itself, pushing the rest of the mourners toward their ritual of closure. I sit at the table in my living room, the letter and records spread out before me. My hands tremble slightly, though I don't understand why. Not at first, then I find his name in the files. Official, typed, faded slightly, but legible, familiar to anyone who has lived here long enough. He once held a position people didn't question. Authority that was quiet, unquestioned, unquestionable. And I think of him at the funeral, standing apart, watching, waiting. The room feels colder now, the walls narrower. I can hear the snow against the window pane, soft at first, then growing heavier. The sound becomes a rhythm, echoing the unease in my chest. I pull the photograph of my mother from the table. Her eyes are closed in the frame, serene, calm. The kind of calm no one knew the cost of. I imagine her that day, watching, seeing him, feeling something she didn't say. The tension in her shoulders. The brief glance she cast toward the man who seemed out of place. I trace his name with my finger on the record. Each letter presses harder than it should. I want to erase him. I want to fold the paper over and pretend I never saw it, but I don't. The wind rattles the window. A branch scratches against the siding. Small noises that make me jump, make my pulse quicken. I think of the authority he held, the unspoken power in his position. How easily someone like that could shape stories, could determine which truths were told, which ones were forgotten, which ones were buried. I can almost feel his gaze in the photograph, not on me, not directly, but present. Like the air before a storm, thick and charged, I remember the ceremony itself, the few words spoken, the brief prayers, the lowering of the coffin. Everyone moved on quickly, as if the act of closure could erase more than just grief. But he didn't move on, not at first. He lingered, a shadow among us, separate from the collective mourning. His eyes scanning, measuring, weighing. I didn't understand then. I understand a little now. I remember feeling a flicker of anger at the time, though I couldn't name why. Who was this man? Why was he here? Why did his presence feel so deliberate? I copy his name. I got notebook. Cook. Here's Flo, careful. Each stroke of the pen feels like a reclamation, like marking territory over the silence he carries. I leaned back in my chair. The pages around me feel heavier than they did before. Records, letters, copies, photographs. Each one is a piece of a story someone tried to control, a story someone tried to simplify, but they forgot. I look toward the window. Snow has begun to fall again, large, soft flakes, covering footprints, erasing paths. The world outside seems calm, indifferent even, but I know the truth isn't erased. Not by snow, not by silence, not by authority. I think again of the man at the funeral. His coat pressed, his gloves spotless, his watch just visible beneath the cuff. He had expected something to stay forgotten, something to remain buried. I feel a chill, not just from the air, not from the winter that presses against the glass, but from the realization that some people walk through life believing they can control the past, shape the present, and erase what doesn't serve them. I close my eyes briefly. I see the gravesite, the open earth, my mother's folded hands resting on the casket, the crowd moving as one, stepping back, letting the ceremony end, and him, always him, Hestumly. When I open my eyes, the notebook is in front of me, his name written there, no judgment, no accusation, just a record. I understand now that remembering is an act of quiet rebellion, that holding on to truth, even fragments, is enough to resist erasure. I stand, moving toward the window. The snow blurs the edges of the street, the cemetery, the world outside. It softens everything, but not the memory. Not the vigilance that comes with knowing the story is incomplete because someone chose it to be. I touch the glass, cold, unyielding, and I whisper, almost to myself, I see you. The wind presses harder. The flakes swirl more densely. The house feels small again. The walls are close. I take the notebook in my hands, holding it against my chest. The weight of her story, of his presence, of all the silences, presses into me. And I know this is only the beginning, because someone expected the story to end at the grave. But I'm still listening. The room smells faintly of lavender and old paper. I sit at the edge of my mother's desk. The letter unfolded before me. The light from the window falls across the paper, soft late afternoon gold. Dust motes drift in the beam, moving slowly, aimlessly, as if they too are listening. I pick up the letter again, hesitating over the first line. The words are hers, careful, deliberate, measured. But there are gaps, pauses where sentences might have been, spaces where names should have been. The absence speaks louder than the ink ever could. I trace the words with my finger. The paper is thin, slightly rough. Each letter presses faintly against my fingertip. Each pause feels deliberate. She avoided certain names, certain accusations. There is no indictment here, no sharp edge of blame. Instead, she writes of fear, of nights spent listening to voices she could not answer, of doors she opened because she trusted someone she should not have, of decisions made to survive, to protect herself, to endure. I feel her caution, her restraint, her quiet wisdom. Her handwriting slows toward the middle, the lines shorten, words fragment. I can see the thought in each curve of the letters, each stroke weighed carefully, choosing survival over truth, choosing safety over confrontation. I breathe slowly, letting the rhythm of her words sink in. I reread a passage where she writes about fear curling around her like smoke, invisible but suffocating. The sentence ends abruptly unfinished. I wonder who she feared most, who she trusted enough to hide the story from. The afternoon light changes, moving across the paper. Shadows stretch along the folds. I notice how she writes at the bottom almost as an afterthought, almost a whisper. Not for revenge, not for anger, not for justice in the way the world imagines it. She asks for acknowledgement, for recognition that what happened mattered, that what she endured mattered, that her silence was not peace, that her life, her decisions, her fear were not nothing. I pause. The penmanship is steady, almost gentle, even as it carries the weight of years. I feel her presence in the room, not as a ghost, not as a shadow, just the careful cadence of her mind, lingering in the spaces she left behind. I fold the letter slightly, hesitant to close the space between us. Her words press against the quiet like a heartbeat. I can hear them echo in the room, faint, patient, insistent. The floor creaks as I shift. The chair groans beneath me. Outside, a branch scratches against the window pane, scraping rhythmically. I am alone, but I do not feel it. Her words fill the silence. I read the final line again. Peace is not the same as silence. I think of the silence around her death, of the way people left quickly at the funeral, off by Haven Fries, of the neighbors who nodded, rehearsed the story of a peaceful end. Was she ever given either? I close my eyes. The memory of her voice rises soft, deliberate, careful, like the letters she wrote at Chuao Shivi. I see her sitting at the table, hands folded over each other, the candlelight flickering across the room. I hear the quiet decision behind each word she never spoke aloud. The weight of living in fear, the cost of choosing what to survive. I open my eyes. The letter rests in my hands, fragile but whole. I notice the gaps again, the unspoken names, the questions left suspended. I realize that reading her letter is not about finding every answer. It is about understanding the restraint, the fear, and the courage it took to write it all. The light outside fades, pale and gray. I linger over the lines she emphasized, tracing the subtle pauses. I imagine her measuring every word as if it were a lifeline. The paper trembles slightly under my fingers, and I tremble too, with the weight of her unspoken truths. I whisper aloud, softly, "I see you, Mom." No reply comes, of course, only the rustle of paper as I shift. The wind presses against the window, a distant reminder of the world moving on. The quiet is almost comforting now, almost companionable. I reread the letter a final time. Her caution is evident, her restraint, her insistence that acknowledgement matters more than revenge. Each sentence is a careful negotiation with memory and fear. Each pause, a silent testimony to the parts of life she could not share. I fold the paper carefully and slide it into my notebook. It feels heavier now, carrying both her words and her silences. I close the notebook, resting my hands on it, breathing slowly. Her story is not finished. Her truth, however quiet, still speaks. Outside, the sky darkens. Snow begins again, soft, muffling the world. I stand and move toward the window, watching flakes swirl, covering tracks, softening edges. I think of the lines she wrote about peace and silence. I think of the choices she made. I think of the gaps she left for me to notice, for me to understand. I turn back to the room, still faintly scented of lavender and paper. The chair, the desk, the quiet corners, all hold fragments of her presence. I trace the edge of the notebook with my finger. Acknowledgement, I realize, is a fragile thing, a promise, a memory. And I take a deep breath, letting the quiet fill me. I feel both her absence and her guidance. And I know, with a kind of solemn certainty, that reading between the lines is the only way to hear her fully. The room darkens as the evening settles. I place the notebook carefully on the desk. The letter remains, a witness to fear, courage, and restraint. And somewhere between the written words and the silences, I feel her still asking for recognition. I step back from the desk, the candle flickers low. Outside, the snow continues to fall, relentless and gentle. And I whisper once more, almost to the wind, almost to her memory, "I see you." The page, the room, the silence, all hold the weight of acknowledgement, and I know this is not the end. Kai Ifro Katafa. It is only the moment when I begin to understand The studio smells faintly of coffee and paper. I sit across from the reporter, the microphone between us, cold metal pressing lightly against the wooden table. Kat, the lights are soft, diffused, almost forgiving, but they illuminate every detail in the room. The scratches on the table, the chipped edge of a mug, the faint stain from a long-forgotten spill. Outside, the city hums, indifferent, carrying snow against windows I cannot see. I clear my throat, slow and deliberate. Cat! The words feel heavy in my chest, but my voice remains steady. I begin at the beginning, the letter in the snow, the unopened room, the pauses in her handwriting. I speak the story as it happened, quietly, without embellishment. Every sentence carries a weight I cannot lift, but I lift it anyway. The reporter nods occasionally, pen scratching, eyes focused, absorbing without interruption. The room holds the quiet between my words. Every pause stripbrai sitrapam durand. Every pause stretches, deliberate like a held breath. The story is unadorned, but its power is in its restraint. Jali, I speak of fear, of choices, of survival over truth. I speak of silences that were mistaken for peace, of authority that shaped memory, and of people who thought some things should remain buried. I speak, and each word lands softly but firmly, like snow on the branches outside. A woman in the corner stirs. She lifts her hand, hesitates, then lowers it. She is remembering, I realize. Things she once ignored, stories she pushed aside because they were inconvenient. I notice the shift in the room. Small acknowledgments, quiet nods, the subtle exhale of people who finally see what they had been too busy to notice before. I do not mention the man from the funeral. I do not name him. He does not call, he does not write. Perhaps he watches from a distance, perhaps he waits. Perhaps he does not know how to respond to words finally spoken aloud. My voice carries on. I read her letter again, quoting her carefully, emphasizing the lines she underlined in her own mind. Peace is not the same as silence. I explain how she asked for acknowledgement, not revenge. How her story had been partially erased by the weight of authority and fear, and how those pieces still demanded reckoning. Outside, the wind presses against the building, soft and constant. I pause, listening, letting the rhythm of my voice mingle with the quiet hum of the city. I notice the subtle reactions, a tear, a nod, the tightening of hands around a notebook. Yet these are the small signs that truth, finally spoken, can ripple outward, even through walls that seemed impermeable. I finish recounting the events. No one applauds. There is no fanfare. The room exhales with me, a collective acknowledgement of the story we had all avoided for too long. Later, alone, I walk through the house that once held her presence. The rooms are quiet, still scented faintly of lavender and old paper. I pass the clock in the living room. The ticking, constant for years, finally stops. The pendulum rests. Restchen, the hands frozen. I realize the house has been holding its breath, waiting for this story to be told. I sit in her chair near the window. The light falls gently across the floor, pale and forgiving. I think about the weight of a buried truth, how long it can linger in silence, Totterfurt, and what happens when it is finally given air. I feel the walls breathe with me, the floor creak softly, as if the house remembers her too. I reread the letter once more, folding it carefully, placing it atop the notebook where I have traced her words, her pauses, her choices. The silence in the house is different now, fuller but lighter, as though it carries a small release. The air feels sharper, clearer, like the first cold breath after a long storm. I look out the window, watching snow gather along the edges of the roof. The city hums faintly, indifferent, yet I know the story has escaped these walls. Walls. It has touched ears that were ready to listen, hearts prepared to acknowledge what had been ignored. I whisper her words, almost to myself, almost to the empty room. Peace is not the same as silence. The phrase hangs in the air, gentle but unyielding. And I realize the power of saying something aloud is not in the noise it makes, but in the weight it lifts from the shoulders that carried it alone. The wind rattles the window pane, the shadows lengthen, soft against the walls, embracing the quiet. I feel her near me, not as a ghost, but as a witness to the story finally spoken, a participant in the recognition she longed for. I rise, careful not to disturb the notebook, the letter. The room feels smaller, closer, intimate, as though the telling has shifted something subtle, permanent. I leave the chair, step toward the door. The light outside dims further, snow swirling, erasing tracks, softening shapes. The house exhales, the ticking clock silent, and the story, long hidden, long restrained, floats outward, gentle, deliberate, heard. I pause in the doorway, hand on the knob, and think, what happens when a buried truth is allowed air? Can. I step into the hall, quiet but steady, knowing that the story will continue to live, inacknowledged, in memory, in the careful weight of every word finally spoken. The door closes softly behind me, snow presses against the windows, indifferent, relentless, and the house, at last, is still. The snow has receded, leaving the yard mottled with brown and gray. I step carefully, boots sinking into the soft earth, mud clinging stubbornly to the soles. The winter that held her letter, her secrets, her restraint is gone. The cold has lifted, but the air still carries a faint chill, a reminder of the nights I spent reading her words by candlelight. I pause where the envelope once rested, buried in frost and silence. The stone in my hand feels heavy, but not burdensome. I carry it slowly, deliberately toward the patch of earth that remembers. It is small, unpolished, ordinary. Yet it is enough. Enough to mark the space, not with grandeur, but with acknowledged recognition of her, of the story she entrusted to me, of the truths finally spoken aloud. I kneel, pressing the stone gently into the thawing soil. The mud clings, cold and wet, wrapping around my fingers as if insisting I stay present with the moment. I do not speak. No words can honor this fully. The earth accepts the stone quietly, like it has held these secrets too long. Her house looms behind me, still familiar yet different. The windows catch the early sunlight, pale and forgiving. The walls do not feel oppressive now. The house exhales, lighter somehow, though still tinged with absence. I step back and let my eyes trace the contours. The doorframe she polished, the roofline where icicles once hung like brittle teeth, the garden bed where the first crocuses pushed timidly through the thaw. Inside, I can almost hear the echoes of her movements, a drawer opening, the creak of a floorboard, the low hum of her voice when she thought herself alone. The memories do not haunt. They linger softly, like sunlight through lace curtains. Her story is no longer mine alone to carry. It has been shared, acknowledged, given air. I remember the letter in my coat pocket, how its weight pressed against my chest, how every word shaped the way I moved through the house, the town, the world. It told of fear, of choices she made to survive, of silences that were mistaken for peace. And now, with the stone in place, the letter read aloud, and the acknowledgement of others behind me, it feels as though a layer of frost has lifted from the very ground. I walk slowly across the yard, boots squelching softly. The mud grips, reluctant to let go, just as I had held on to her story, afraid that any release would erase her memory or dishonor her struggles. But release is not forgetting, it is recognition, quiet and deliberate. I pause at the edge of the garden, looking down at the thin shoots of green. Life persists even where winter has pressed hard, and in that persistence I feel something shift. Perhaps she has found it now, the peace she asked for, not in silence but in acknowledgement. Perhaps the telling of her story has finally given her that small, necessary room to breathe. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint, lingering notes of lavender. I close my eyes and let it wash over me, imagining her smile in some quiet place beyond my sight. The stone at my feet, the yard thawing, the house exhaling, all reminders that truth, once buried, can bloom in its own time. I stand, brushing mud from my palms, looking at the house one last time before turning toward the street. The world outside continues, indifferent and yet newly attentive. I notice neighbors shoveling the remaining patches of snow, children splashing in puddles, the sun reflecting off wet pavement. Life goes on, and it carries her story along with it, subtle, quiet, undeniable. A crow calls from a distant tree, wings catching the sunlight, black against pale blue. I watch it for a moment, thinking of the nights I read her letter by candlelight, of the silence that used to press in around me, of the weight now lifted. The yard feels spacious, the air freer, the house waiting patiently behind me. I touch the stone lightly with the back of my hand. It is small, ordinary, but enough to mark a shift. Enough to say I remember, I acknowledge, I carry this with care, not alone, but with others who now know. I breathe deeply, letting the cool air fill my lungs, imagining her beside me, not in body, but in memory and in acknowledgement. I think of her words, peace is not the same as silence. And I understand now that peace is possible when the story is told, when recognition is given, when the silence has been broken without anger, without accusation, simply with truth. I take a step back, leaving the stone and the thawing earth behind. The ground glistens with residual moisture, catching the sun in fleeting sparkles. Okay, the house looks warmer now, less like a weight and more like a home where its breath in relief. For the first time since the letter appeared in the snow, I feel a quiet release. The story is out. The story is acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, the air feels lighter, the yard less empty, and the house finally at ease. Okay. I pause at the edge of the property, looking back once more. The stone rests where it belongs, the earth soft beneath it, the air carrying the faint echo of a voice once silenced. I wonder if she is finally listening, smiling at peace. And as I walk away, boots pressing through the wet, yielding ground, I leave behind more than mud and snow. I leave behind the burden of silence, the weight of untold truth. I step into the sunlight, carrying her story gently, deliberately, finally free to breathe. The wind lifts again, brushing across the yard, over the stone around the house. It feels like acknowledgement, like release, like the quiet certainty that comes after snow melts and the world, finally, remembers. The chapter ends, but the story carries on, in memory, in acknowledgement, and in the quiet pulse of life returning to the yard she once called home.